Hey y'all, I think we're going to get started here. So just a quick reminder, please turn off your phones, any other noisemakers. Also, I'll give another quick reminder at the end of the talk, but please do fill out the surveys that you should receive in your email inbox after this talk. It helps ensure that you guys have the best GDC experience that you can have. And with that, good morning, welcome to my talk, Making Moves, Designing Spartan Abilities for Halo 5 Guardians. I know this is kind of an early one, and I know we're not all making the best decisions at these evening events at GDC, so thanks for making it out of bed for this one. With that, let me quickly introduce myself a bit further. My name is Ryan Darcey, aka Spartan 1205. I'm an 11-year industry veteran, and I've had the pleasure of working at the following companies: Terminal Reality, LucasArts, and 343 Industries. Over the years, I've curated a career that's involved a lot of bouncing around with regard to roles and responsibility, which is to say, I wear the jack-of-all-trades badge with pride and approach game development from all angles. Now, with that in mind, my schizophrenic career has evolved more or less like this: level designer, gameplay engineer, secret weapon, don't be jelly, this is real, but it's just some PR and marketing work, producer, level designer again, and systems designer. Also, these are all the games I've worked on, but not necessarily shipped. And of course, Halo 5 Guardians. This is almost definitely why you're here, and if there was any doubt, it will be the focus of my talk. Now, as I stated in the description for this talk, Halo has a long legacy of delivering highly balanced, competitive first-person shooter gameplay, where concepts like 30 seconds of fun and Golden Triangle laid the foundation for the player experience. But after releasing 6 successful titles spanning the course of 14 years, how do you advance the IP while maintaining the fundamental philosophy? What's going to make Halo feel fresh again? How much do you risk alienating the community that brought you this far? Well, Spartan abilities are just some of the features 343 delivered in Halo 5 Guardians to answer these questions, and they were the focus of my responsibility throughout the project's duration. During this talk, I'll be discussing the process of taking 2 of these new Spartan abilities from concept to final release: Spartan Charge and Ground Pound. Also, just to give this talk a bit more structure, I'll be breaking it up into 3 acts. Act 1, the setup, or choosing where to innovate. Act 2, confrontation, or mapping actions to controls. And Act 3, resolution, or tuning for balance. Now, before I dive in, I first want to recognize all the brilliant, talented people who have contributed to the Halo legacy leading up to Halo 5, as well as those currently working alongside me at 343. I consider myself very fortunate to have an opportunity to present this talk, but the story I'm telling here involves many characters, and I'm just one small player in the grand scheme of things. Also, this talk has purposefully molded history into a more structured, easily understood story so that you might take some actionable learnings home with you. The reality is, game development is messy, including Halo 5, and what I'm presenting to you here is all viewed through the clear, malleable lens of hindsight. And so, with those disclaimers, I know it may have been a while since some of you have Haloed, so let's take a quick look at the Spartan in Halo 5. And if it's been a really long time, I should remind you that the Spartan is a playable character in the Halo franchise.
I have a job to do.
No one's gonna take me alive. You and I must try to survive. Contact!
Hopefully y'all are awake now after that one. And hopefully that was a quick refresher of what the Spartan is and what form they took in Halo 5 Guardians. So with that out of the way, let's move on to Act 1 of this talk. The setup, or choosing where to innovate. Or more specifically, choosing where to innovate for the Spartan. And although this talk is mainly about Spartan Charge and Ground Pound, in order to understand how we chose to develop those abilities for our hero, we have to briefly talk about the other abilities that led up to them first. But even before that, we need to talk about Batman. Early on in this project, whenever we were talking about the Spartan, Batman often worked his way into the conversation. Our sandbox design lead, Chris King, often held him up as a model for what we wanted to do with the Spartan in Halo 5. Why is that? Well, I thought it was going to be clever and invent a new phrase, but the internet already beat me to it with a meme. So here's a quick sampling of some before and after Batman examples. We've got Wonder Woman, Superman, Aquaman, Catwoman, Spider-Man, for some reason Angelina Jolie, and finally, the man himself. Even Batman's Batman. What I'm talking about here is the Batman effect, and if it's not clear, I'll get more specific in a minute. For Halo 5, we wanted to reimagine the Spartan experience. But what does that really mean? Well, honestly, there aren't really any big gameplay gaps we were trying to fill. How many gameplay gaps are there in Halo right now? That was and continues to be one of the most difficult things for us on the sandbox design team. And sort of related to that point, we're at great risk of overcomplicating things. In Jamie Griesemer's 2010 Design and Detail talk, he describes balance as a barely manageable number of choices. In his 2012 talk, he also discusses the idea of the player's mental system requirements, which models the player's ability to handle simple and complex problems and how that changes drastically with the speed at which the player is required to execute them. Ultimately, this demands that we don't overwhelm the player with new actions in an already crowded player decision-making space. And finally, on the evolutionary path, we have to make sure that Halo remains Halo. We've got a very vocal, dedicated fan base that's extremely important to 343 in the franchise. We can't change Halo so much that these players feel like strangers to the game. Not to mention, Halo isn't really broken, we don't need to fix it, or, in the wise words of our sandbox design lead, Chris King, don't fuck it up. So where does that leave us? Well, I like to think that we approach the Spartan similar to how Christopher Nolan approached Batman in the Dark Knight trilogy. Batman still has the same gadgets, but the way they're packaged together makes them feel fresh again. Arguably, the Batman we see in the Dark Knight trilogy is to date the most visceral version of that Batman fantasy. So ultimately, we wanted to follow Christopher Nolan's lead and double down on the Spartan fantasy by refining some of the gameplay such that it embodies the most visceral version of that Spartan fantasy. And to kick off this process, we started asking a lot of questions about what it means to be a Spartan. Questions like, what's it like to wear the Mjolnir armor? Does it really feel like you're a super soldier space marine tank? I'm looking at you, fall damage. What about all those old cinematics that showed Spartans flying around with thrusters? Why couldn't we use them in normal gameplay? Is there a way to ground this fantasy more strongly in the core gameplay loop? What should we leverage from previous Halo iterations? And why weren't they as awesome as they could have been? These were all great questions that pointed at valid criticisms of the Spartan gameplay at the start of Halo 5. By asking them, we were able to refine the definition of a Spartan, which then we could use to help refine gameplay related to the Spartan. And this is my version of that Spartan definition in absence of a formal one. A run-and-gun pit bull with a high-tech, thruster-powered combat suit that can give and take a beating, or what a Spartan is to me. Now that we have that as an underlying force driving our decision-making process, what does that actually mean for gameplay? Where should we focus? After much discussion across a large portion of the team, we found our answers along two upgrade paths for what later became known as the Spartan abilities. These two upgrade paths were mobility upgrades and melee upgrades. First, I'll talk about mobility upgrades. Then, once you have an understanding of how those shaped up, it'll become more clear as to how this allowed for Spartan Charge and Ground Pound to become the melee upgrades. To kick it off, we'll take a look at this video I recorded early on for an internal sales pitch that highlights some of the Spartan abilities one by one. First, we've got Evade, or what later became known as Thruster Pack, which allows you to burst quickly in any direction. Then we've got Clamber, where you can pull yourself up on ledges. Vault, which was a variation on Clamber that eventually got cut. Of course, Slide, which is pretty straightforward. Shoulder Bash, which later became Spartan Charge. And Stabilizer with some broken animations. Remember, this is pretty early on. Okay, those with the keen eye and those of you who have been paying attention, you may have noticed that the Ground Pound didn't show up there. And that's because it almost got cut. At one point, these were all the features we were going to ship with, but eventually we did manage to pull it back in. Now, before we dig into the details for these mobility upgrades, I'd like to first define the Halo Joust and how that compares to combat and other popular first-person shooters, because I'll be referencing the Joust a lot through this talk. So let's take a look at how core combat in a game like Call of Duty differs from Halo. One of the defining characteristics of Call of Duty is its low vitality model and corresponding short time to kill. It only takes a few shots with any weapon to drop your enemy. The best comparison I can make is to a game of hide and seek. Spotting enemies and getting the first shot off is essential for being a successful Call of Duty player, and there's little time to react. Ultimately, I would argue that your best defense is a good offense here. It's a very aggressive style of play. Conversely, in a game like Halo, the high vitality model creates a substantially longer time to kill compared to Call of Duty. The core combat unfolds much more like a game of speed chess, as the player has a lot more opportunity to react and successfully turn around and encounter if they're attacked first. In Halo, there is more of a focus on anticipating your enemy's next move, dodging their attacks, and baiting them into vulnerable positions. In this way, we could argue that Halo is a Street Fighter of first-person shooters. Ultimately, a successful Halo player is going to need to have more patience in an encounter. You have to be a lot more picky about when to engage an enemy. In contrast to Call of Duty, I would argue that your best offense is a good defense. So, hopefully that quick primer on the Halo joust will put everything I'm about to review in the right context, and let's keep it in mind as we discuss the mobility upgrades. We're going to take a look at the non-thruster powered mobility upgrades first, or those that I would attribute to the Spartan underneath the armor. And we'll start with increased run acceleration and increased run speed. This may sound like a subtle thing, but it stemmed from a renewed focus on competitive play. In fact, it was one of the first requests I can remember getting from the MP team and the Pro team. Why is that? Well, it adds some nuance to the Halo joust. And the nuance we're adding here is that the players are able to strafe left and right more quickly, which allows them to dodge precision headshots. In the end, this ultimately made the Spartan more responsive, but it also made it slightly harder to handle. It's kind of like the difference between a Mustang and a Lamborghini. They're both powerful cars, but those who are comfortable with the pickup on a Mustang might not be comfortable with the pickup on a Lamborghini. Maybe you're not identifying with that metaphor, but as someone who drives a Prius C, I'm sticking with it. Anyway, moving on to clamber, which allows you to grasp nearby ledges and pull yourself up where you might have fallen short from a jump previously. I consider clamber one of our most drastic mobility improvements, and it totally changed how we navigate and therefore build our maps. More specifically, it increased the verticality of the arena. Ultimately, this made platforming way less frustrating, as it's much more difficult to gauge distances and jump with precision in first-person shooters, and this allowed for a lot more slop. So, onto our final non-thruster-powered mobility upgrade, slide, which quickly transitions to the crouch state from a sprint and gives you a slight speed boost into cover or around a corner. In contrast to clamber, this is probably the most inconsequential mobility upgrade. That said, I would argue that you can't turn everything up to 11. It's important to recognize a feature's position in the greater feature set, and you still need to provide enough benefits at higher levels of play. In addition, the conservation of momentum feels good. In general, conserving some momentum can make movement feel more natural. You just have to be careful about where to use it, because you don't want to make the player feel too unresponsive, especially in a highly competitive game like in Halo, where a single frame delay can make the difference between a player saying, "I love it," versus "I hate it." All right, now let's discuss the thruster-powered mobility upgrades, and first, we'll talk about stabilizer, which very simply allows you to hover in the air while zoomed. This was originally a weapon attachment developed by our weapons designer, Dan Wixton. However, as time went on and the design for our weapons in Spartan got more refined, we ported the tech to be as part of the core Spartan abilities. The next mobility upgrade we implemented was a thruster pack. This replaced armor abilities from Halo 4, like hard lead shield, active camo, jetpack, etc., and allowed the player to thrust quickly in any direction. Why did this replace armor abilities? Well, it was part of our Fair Start initiative and renewed focus on competitive play. For Halo 5, we wanted to ensure that everyone started out on an even playing field at the beginning of a match, and this was accomplished by everyone spawning with the exact same loadout in arena modes. Additionally, the thruster pack created a heartbeat underneath the Halo joust. The thruster pack has a cooldown, and the player must wait 3.25 seconds between every use. This limited nature created bursts of action within a joust that altered our joust flow more than any other ability. One final thing worth noting about thruster pack is it exacerbated some escapability problems. Remember, Halo's high vitality model means that the time to kill is much longer than most games, so it gives the player a get-out-of-jail-free card with the thruster pack, and it could lead to a lot of unfinished jousts if not balanced properly, leaving the attacker feeling frustrated. And our final mobility upgrade didn't help with this escapability problem either, infinite sprint. First, let me mention that second to whether or not we included D-Scope for Halo 5, the inclusion of Sprint was one of the most contentious discussions within the studio, specifically because of this escapability problem I just mentioned. But in 2015, Sprint is a staple for the modern FPS gamer. Leaving it out of Halo 5 would have been ignoring a huge portion of the gaming demographics expectations, so the call was made to include it. Additionally, we didn't want to create another resource to manage. This meant leaning towards infinite sprint, which in turn complemented Giant Battlegrounds and Warzone, our much-hyped new multiplayer mode. So these were all the mobility upgrades we shipped in Halo 5. What didn't make the cut? Really only one significant Spartan ability was lost in the end. Here's a pretty simple previs showing proof we pursued and subsequently cut a boost jump. Nothing fancy here, pretty straightforward. We've seen this in other games. But what happened with boost jump? Why did it get cut? Well, we quickly realized that clamber was already increasing the verticality of the battlefield to a great degree. Adding a boost jump on top of this was getting a little bit crazy. Not to mention, clamber was already utilizing the button press we wanted for boost jump, press and jump again while in the air. Finally, to really put the nail in the coffin, our level metrics were already locked, and a lot of spaces would need to be reworked in order to support this additional increase in vertical gameplay. So ultimately, we cut this to reduce complexity and redundancy. This is one of those decisions that can be super difficult to make, because it wasn't a problem of boost jump being fun or not having enough time to execute it. It was totally fun, and it was pretty much done. However, when you look at it in context with the greater feature set and the state of the project at the time, you start to realize that the benefits aren't being outweighed by the drawbacks. So, now that we've got a good understanding of where all the mobility upgrades landed, we can talk about how they were leveraged for Spartan, Charge, and Ground Pound as the melee upgrades. To start, let's talk about Halo's Golden Triangle. In many other first-person shooter games, melee is pretty secondary to the core combat loop. For Halo, it's front and center. Why is that? Well, largely because of Halo's unique vitality model. That extra layer of shields on top of your body requires a lot of damage to kill an enemy. Oftentimes, just firing your weapon isn't the most efficient way to take an enemy down. So melee attacks can do a significant amount of damage when you're up close. Also, grenades can do an even better job of softening up the enemy when you have them from a distance. And in addition to the unique vitality model, a majority of the Halo joust takes place with both players firing weapons from the hip. This means the engagement range is pulled closer and the range of movement is greater than most shooters, which in turn allows for more melee opportunities. These three damage dealing mechanisms, weapons, grenades, melee, all sit at the points of Halo's Golden Triangle. Mastering these elements is integral to competitive play. And as I stated earlier, we set out to bolster that melee point by leveraging all the mobility upgrades, so let's take a look at how that was accomplished. We'll start by taking a look at Spartan Charge. Spartan Charge is a thruster-powered melee attack that has three main benefits over normal melee: increased lunge range, increased knockback distance, and increased damage. The mobility upgrades leveraged for this action were first sprint, in the way that it was used for balancing by requiring the player to be at full sprint before triggering Spartan Charge. In addition, we utilized thruster pack, as it was what powered the action both fictionally and technically under the hood. So how about our other melee upgrade, Ground Pound? Ground Pound allows the player to close the gap from above very quickly, and with enough skill can be used to take out an enemy with one direct hit. Additionally, the AoE upon landing will knock enemies back just like Spartan Charge and deal the same amount of increased melee damage. The mobility upgrades leveraged for this action were first Clamber, in the way that it allowed for the increased verticality of the battlefield, which then allows for Ground Pound since it has a minimum height requirement. We also utilized Stabilizer, as it was used while charging and allowed the player to line up their target more easily. Now that we've got an understanding of what the mobility upgrades were and how they were leveraged for the melee upgrades, we can move on to the second act of this talk to review Spartan Charge and Ground Pound in more detail. Act 2, Confrontation, or Mapping Actions to Controls. And just to be upfront, this is where the talk starts going deep, and I'll be hurling a lot of information your way. I'll do my best to keep it moving and keep it clear, but if you feel a little overwhelmed, don't worry about trying to take detailed notes. This video is going to be posted up on the site later. You can always go back to it. And with that said, please hold on to your butts, and let's check out the button landscape rolling into Halo 5. By the time we got around to implementing Spartan Charge and Ground Pound, every button was already used for something. This required us to get creative when mapping new actions to controls, and by creative, I mean we were going to have to trigger this through some contextual button combo, or contextual button press, or some contextual button combo. So we pursued a bunch of different options and focused on three key areas to determine whether a given control scheme was working out. First there was balance, then user experience, and finally player intent. Now let's define exactly what those three areas of evaluation were. First, we'll look at balance, where we ask the question, how does the control scheme affect the risk-reward of the feature? We have to ask this question because not only did some of the control schemes change up the button presses, but at times they also forced us to change the sequence of the action. This had the potential to impact effectiveness with the danger of pushing it too far on the spectrum towards being too powerful or too weak. And when evaluating balance, we further asked ourselves the question, with some fine-tuning, will the risk ever match reward? Largely, this means having enough knobs to turn when balancing the feature. Too few knobs meant not enough control to dial in the effectiveness. This idea will be discussed later in the talk, but you can think about designers manipulating variables like an artist using different sized paintbrushes. You get the broad strokes in with the bigger paintbrushes, but then you need the smaller ones to get the fine detail in there. Also, you have to ask if the sequence provides a sufficient opportunity for a tell. We are at great risk of making both of these actions too cheap if we couldn't communicate what was going on to other players, especially for competitive games that require reactions within fractions of a second. And as a side note on tells, make audio a priority. You might think that visual indications are better because light travels faster than sound, so players will be able to react to that better than some auditory input. But it actually takes your brain more cycles to process visual input compared to auditory input. This is the reason why races are started with the bang of a gun rather than some other visual notification. Not to mention, if you're playing a first-person shooter, a lot of the action is going to be happening off-screen, so visuals are doing nothing for you there. That said, these are the things considered when evaluating how balanced a control scheme was. Now, on to user experience, where we ask the question, how easy is it for the player to execute the action reliably? Things to consider when evaluating user experience include, are the player's thumbs on the sticks? And why is this? Well, movement and aiming are the most twitchy aspects of a first-person shooter, and you need access to that input at all times when you're in combat. Next, we have to ask, is there a risk of triggering this action by accident? And when you're talking about console controllers, this question normally translates to, is the button that triggers this action on the thumbstick? And if so, can you safeguard against accidental clicks? And if not, is it okay if the player triggers it by accident? Which brings us to our next question. Are the buttons chosen for the action intuitive? This is a more subtle point, but important. Largely, this means sticking to conventions that other games in your genre follow whenever possible. But it also means ensuring contextual or combos make sense by being related to the action the button normally triggers. Next, we ask if it's difficult to execute. This is pretty straightforward, but to break it down, it's really two things. Are there too many buttons to press in the combo? And is it physically straining to press the buttons? And finally, are the conditions above satisfied across all the control configurations? We ship with 10 preset control configurations in Halo 5, and it was extremely important to ensure that a majority, if not all, of the above was satisfied with all the control schemes. Now, with the user experience evaluation defined, let's move on to player intent. When evaluating player intent, we ask the question, is there any ambiguity when interpreting the button presses? As I mentioned, since we're out of unique button presses, we may have to stomp normal button press actions given the game state context. For example, having one button trigger something when you're on the ground, and the same button trigger something else while you're in the air. This can involve a little bit of mind reading on our part, which is always a bit dangerous. And by mind reading, I mean, at the moment the player hits a button, we had to make sure that they were triggering the action the player intended to execute. For example, did they want to trigger what the button normally does, or did they want the contextual override? So let's dig into some control schemes and see where we landed. First, we'll begin with Spartan Charge, and let's take a look at the original design spec for the feature. We've got a quick description of how to execute it, in this case, pressing melee at top sprint speed. Another quick description to relay its primary role, high melee damage with knockback. Its frequency use, medium, which may seem slightly arbitrary, but I believe it makes sense when you're talking about relative frequency compared to other Spartan abilities. And lastly, some additional info about how this action might be used to break weakened structures. And that's it. This was the design spec for Spartan Charge. As you can see, I'm not a fan of documentation. I'd much rather start with something simple like this than have conversations with everyone else involved so they can help hash out the details. To an extent, I view my job as a designer to be an idea curator. That is to say, choosing the best ones and combining them together in the most elegant, fun way. Everyone has different approaches to that process, so I'm not going to claim that mine is right. However, I do think that you need to play to your personal strengths when you decide what your design process is going to be. And before I go off on what it means to be a designer, let's take a look at the initial Spartan Charge previews done by our lead gameplay animator, Pat Gillette. Previews was the next step after documentation and happened before a single line of code was written. What you're going to want to pay attention to here is how we transition from run to full sprint, and then the bash, and how those stages are communicated to the player. Here it is with the third-person transition on the bash. and what it's going to look like for an enemy. All right, now let's take a look at our first Spartan charge control scheme. Thruster plus melee. Now before we dive into this control scheme, I do want to mention that the previews we just watched is pretty much what we shipped. However, we experimented with a lot of different options along the way before coming full circle to that original design. So, thruster plus melee is one of those failed attempts. How exactly did it work? Well, most of these will have more than one, but there's really only one phase to this control scheme, which is simply pressing thruster and melee at the same time. Pretty straightforward, so let's evaluate how this option scored. On the balance front, we're really only throttling this action by way of the limited thruster pack energy. This is alright, but it's a bit one-dimensional, not a whole lot of additional variables we can tune with this version. So it's a plus, but a weak one. And then on the negative front, there really isn't an opportunity for a tell here at all. As I said, the Spartan charge triggers immediately upon pressing the two buttons, and there isn't anything we can do to communicate to another player that this attack is coming. Really not good. So overall, balance is scoring low on this one. Let's move on to user experience. We've got thumbs on sticks for most configs, that's pretty good. We've got little to no chance for accidental activation, doesn't require a stick click, that's great. Next, I'd say we have an intuitive button combo. Spartan charge is a thruster-powered melee attack after all. Also, it's reminiscent of Destiny's ability execution. The thing I would say there is if you can leverage success found in other games, do it. I wouldn't advocate stealing for the sake of stealing, but usually it's at least worth trying to see how it feels, and maybe you can find ways to improve upon it in the process. Lastly, but very importantly, this only felt good if these actions were on the shoulder buttons. Only one of our 10 control configurations had this set up. Even if we made that one the default, this action would feel pretty bad on the other 9 control schemes. So overall, I'm going to score on the positive end of the spectrum, but that negative one weighs it down pretty heavily. Last, we'll look at player intent. I'd say the double button combo ensured the player was making a deliberate attempt to execute the action. No need for contextual evaluation at the time of a button press. So we're actually looking really good on player intent. However, we don't have all the meters on the positive side of the spectrum, and we probably should, so let's take a look at another control scheme. Full sprint followed by melee attack. Just like the previous, the first phase of this scheme was getting to full sprint speed. Then once you cross that threshold, you press melee to launch the Spartan charge. So how's the balance on this one? Well, the time to full sprint provides a great balancing mechanism. I'll discuss that in more detail at the end of this talk, so let's just take my word for it for now. In addition, there's a great tell in this scheme, both with the thrusters flaring and the change in animation stance during the sprint ramp-up phase. So balance is looking really great on this one. Now, on to user experience. We've got thumbs on sticks, not activating this one by accident. It's an easy button press, and it's an intuitive button press. Everybody was already sprinting towards enemies for melee attacks before Spartan charge was ever pitched. Discoverability was very high with this implementation. Players were triggering it without us ever having to teach how to do it. So user experience is looking pretty damn good here as well. Only one more box to check. Player intent. And it's getting a little complicated here. And by complicated, I mean we can't tell whether the player wants to trigger Spartan charge or normal melee at full sprint speed. But they can quickly exit sprint by pulling back on the stick and then trigger melee instead of Spartan charge. So really not the best, but maybe we can afford to score less than perfect on the player intent front? Yeah, I think that's okay. This is what we ended up shipping with, and it turns out this give-take relationship between the 3 areas worked well for ground pound as well. So let's move on and see what happened there. Here's the original design spec for ground pound. First, the activation, melee at fall speed threshold. And in contrast to Spartan charge, this original pitch was way farther off from the final version, and we'll review why that didn't work in a minute. Then we've got its primary role, deal AoE damage from above. Its frequency use, low, which, relatively speaking, means that it would happen less often than Spartan charge. Other uses, knock back nearby grenades with AoE push, and break weakened structures. There it is, short and sweet. Now, here's another previous animation from Pat Gillette. Let's check it out real quick. First, notice the fall speed threshold, then melee to launch the attack. Here it is from third person. All right, let's check out that control scheme. Fall speed threshold, followed by melee attack. Since this attack is executed in the air, the first phase is always a jump. The next phase for this scheme, which would then be reaching a fall speed threshold. Then, once you reach that threshold, you press melee to launch the ground pound. So let's take a look at balance. We've actually got a pretty good opportunity for a tell, As with Spartan Charge, you have a solid animation stance change when you're falling at the fall speed threshold. That's not bad. However, this was very, very difficult to pull off. Not only was your enemy sprinting, thrustering all over the place, you were falling fast through the air. Timing all this to land a hit was near impossible. We couldn't tune this to be easy enough. The core execution was just too difficult. So we're not looking great from the start, but let's move on to user experience. We've got thumbs on sticks for most configs. It's an easy button press. You're not triggering this one by accident, but it's just not intuitive at all. In my head, the fall speed threshold made total sense on paper, maybe a little bit like the full sprint speed requirement for Spartan Charge, but in reality, not so much. I don't think one person found it intuitive in the studio. So we got a few pluses here, but ultimately the drawbacks are so strong we're barely in the positive on this one. And now let's talk about player intent. There's really no great way to tell if the player wants to melee or ground pound upon reaching the fall speed threshold. We tried to read the player's pitch as an indication, but that difference was just too subtle and too fine of a line to truly differentiate a melee versus a ground pound. So player intent really not looking good on this one either. Obviously the score isn't up to par on this one, so let's take a look at something that was a bit more successful. Hold melee. Again, for this one we'll start with a jump, but then we drop the fall speed threshold phase and replace it with the charging phase by pressing and holding the melee button in the air. Then, once the charge duration is complete, you release the melee button to launch the attack. So let's take a look at balance. Turns out the charge time provided a great balancing tool. In addition, it gave us an opportunity to utilize stabilizer while the player is charging so that they could aim at their target a little bit more easily. Also, this new charge phase created a great opportunity for a tell, both with the silhouette change and the thrusters flaring. So on the balance front, we're looking pretty good here. Now let's take a look at user experience. Again, thumbs on sticks, no chance for accidental activation, easy button press, and finally an intuitive button press. Remember, Spartan Charge and Ground Pound are considered melee upgrades, so it's a good idea to associate them with the melee button. So we really nailed it on user experience with this one, high marks again. Lastly, player intent. By evaluating the game state, we were able to anticipate the player's intent with enough accuracy with regard to executing normal melee versus ground pound, but it wasn't perfect. It required some special case melee button press handling in the air, which I'll briefly touch upon. First, this special logic only applied while the player is in the air. While on the ground, pressing melee behaves exactly as it always does, so this sequence always starts with the jump. Next, the player is going to have to press the melee button. No surprise there, but here's where we start diverging from the normal melee logic, and it's not clear exactly how to proceed at this point. At the time of the button press, we check to see if the player has a melee target. A cone is used to define this search. If the player does indeed have a melee target at the time they press melee in the air, the player lunges towards the enemy for a melee attack. That is to say, it behaves exactly as it normally does on the ground. It's also to say, if you have a melee target in the air and you press melee, you can't start charging ground pound. It's just not allowed. But if you don't have a target at this point, we keep evaluating the player's input for a bit longer, 0.25 seconds to be exact, before we take any action. If the player releases melee before that time is up, they trigger a normal attack and swing in the air. However, if they continue to hold down the melee button press through the time window, the ground pound sequence kicks in and the player enters the charge state. So that's the special case melee button press handling in the air. I'm guessing a majority of players don't even think twice about it, but it can lead to some unresponsive button presses in the heat of combat. At the very least, we do our best to monitor feedback on the forums from the community, and this certainly isn't an issue that's been rising to the list of the top of their grievances. So we can finish this configurations evaluation and note that we're looking really good on the balance and user experience front, and just barely acceptable on the player intent front. Despite this problem with player intent, the scheme ended up being the winner, and it reinforces the idea that you're not always going to find the perfect solution to your design problem. Perfection really doesn't exist in game development. To drive this point home about how elusive perfection is, these are all the fail slides I created for this talk. I only ended up having time to discuss 2 of them, not to mention these slides only represent the schemes that we actually implemented. There were even more options pitched, but they failed the minimum requirements so clearly that we didn't even bother trying them out in game. The bottom line here is sometimes good enough is the best you're going to get. It's a hard pill to swallow, but if you have any desire to ship your game, you have to recognize it. So now that we had the controls locked for Spartan Charge and Ground Pound, it was time to focus on the specific variables driving the action underneath the hood by diving into the third act of this talk, Act 3, Resolution, or Tuning for Balance. Now, we had to ensure that we continued to deliver a Halo experience that holds up against countless hours of competitive play from the most skilled gamers in the world. We really pushed the esport nature of Halo for this release, so these new actions had better fit into that model. Mainly this meant making sure the actions weren't too OP, but the ultimate goal was always to introduce features that were balanced and fully embraced at the highest levels of competitive play. So let's talk about what balance means. In Jamie Griesemer's 2010 talk about tuning the time between shots of the sniper rifle, which is largely multiplayer focused, he says balance is a state, not a process. He goes on to define balance as longevity, breaking this down further by saying the game can be played indefinitely without developer intervention. He also says balance has nothing to do with fun. And before we examine that comment more closely, conversely, in Jamie's 2011 talk about tuning the projectile speed on the plasma rifle, which is largely single-player focused, he goes on to say, tuning has nothing to do with balance, and tuning is crafting fun. Now that we've got that down, I'm going to summon Gavin Rosdale, who's famous for wondering if there's any sex in your violence. Now, he's wondering if there's any fun in your balance. Of course there is. Halo is extremely balanced and extremely fun, and Spartan Charge and Ground Pound need to be both balanced and fun as well. So I'll call in another 90s alt-rock star Billy Joe to back me up with his lesser-known song, Walking Contradiction. What do we make of Jamie's mutually exclusive comments regarding the two forces of balance and fun here? While I agree with his underlying sentiment, we should look at the definition of fun in the context of competitive versus non-competitive games, or game modes, or even difficulty levels for that matter. First, competitive games are fun because they're balanced. Competitive gamers like balanced experiences as they promote usage of a wide variety of tactics that take a long time to master in order to be the best, emphasis on being the best. Alternatively, non-competitive games are fun because of the fantasy fulfillment, which sometimes necessitates the player getting an unbalanced leg up on their enemies in favor of making them feel like a hero, emphasis on making them feel like a hero. So really, being fun and balanced are not mutually exclusive, so long as you're all right with multiple definitions of fun, depending on the context. And now that you all understand where my ideas of balance and fun lie, let's talk about balance knobs, another variation on a theme from one of Jamie's talks. In order to help focus my balancing efforts, I identified specific balance knobs for each feature. These are variables that I found to be most sensitive during the balancing process. There are tons of other variables that require tuning to get Spartan Charge and Ground Pound to a polished state, but their impact on balance was minimal. Now, I'll define some specific balance knobs in a few minutes, but before we do that, we're going to take a look at a process for tuning these balance knobs. First, we must identify the goal, which should define what balance means for that variable. Balance needs to be taken in context, and it's worth making sure that you have clear goals defined so you know when you're successful in pushing the needle in the right direction. Second, we should think about existing metrics. Whenever possible, find similar values in your game that are already balanced or locked as a point of reference. This should help put your first guess in the ballpark and serve as a guide for future iterations. Next, you should think about defining a quantifiable test you can perform at your desk to further refine the initial value you've chosen. Sometimes this can be hard, especially when you're talking about a multiplayer game that can require more than one person to test. That said, it's an important step to take because your time with scenarios that are truly representative of the final gameplay will be limited, for example, external user research sessions. Which brings us to stress test refinement. You have to get away from your desk and test your tuning on the most stress you're able to simulate. For us, this mostly occurred in the form of daily playtests within the Sandbox group. But luckily, 343 also took on some pro Halo players to help with the development process of Halo 5. This gave us a unique opportunity to perform extreme stress tests on a weekly, sometimes daily basis. Pro Team's ability to locate cracks in the foundation and exploit them was incredible. They were involved with helping us find the final tuning for just about every weapon and every feature in the game. And now that we've defined what balance means, what balance knobs are, and we've got a balancing process to help guide us, let's dive into some specific examples. So here's a list of balance knobs I've defined for Spartan Charge. Remember, these are the variables that I found had the greatest impact on balance while developing the feature. We've got time to full sprint, launch speed, launch distance, damage, knockback distance, and recovery time. Since time is limited, I've chosen the balance knobs highlighted in blue to cover in more detail here, so let's break them down with the tuning for balance process by starting with time to full sprint. First, we've got the goal. We need to find a value that affords the player opportunities to use Spartan Charge mid-joust, but in the process don't make our escapability problem worse. So that's our challenge. Next, we take a look at existing metrics. And for this variable, we might want to test the time to full sprint against average hallway length in arena maps. You want to make sure the player can spot an enemy and reach that target in your average play space. Next, we need to find a quantifiable test at our desk. This one's pretty easy. Just load up some arena maps and ensure the average hallway length gives the player enough of a runway to reach top sprint speed. Finally, stress test refinement, where the real magic happens. Pretty early on, we realized that for Spartan Charge to be of any use mid-joust, we had to have a ramp-up time that was actually shorter than we had in Halo 4. So we needed to look into ways that this shortened ramp-up time didn't hurt escapability by introducing additional throttles on sprint besides that ramp-up time. And first, we upgraded stopping power. This actually already existed in Halo 4, and what it did was kick you out of sprint when you received damage. We tweaked it so it took the amount of damage received into account, and that made it a little bit less frustrating. But either way, this sprint throttle alone wasn't going to be enough to cut it, for sure. So we tried implementing a system where shields don't recharge during sprint. This had a huge impact on curbing escapability and ultimately meant that if you tried to run away mid-joust after receiving damage, you're going to be stuck in that vulnerable state for as long as you're sprinting. But we still found this wasn't enough. So we tried making it so the player shows up on the motion tracker when the shields are down. We actually shipped this in the beta, for those that remember, and it did have the effect of making it easier to track down injured players for the kill. However, ultimately, it felt kind of cheap because there wasn't really anything the player could do to avoid this visible state on the radar. So the last thing we did was compress sprint towards the run speed. In order to understand the significance here, you have to remember that you can't fire your weapon while sprinting. So if you sprint at a speed closer to the run speed, where you can fire your weapon, it'll be easier to track and kill your enemy while they're sprinting away. Ultimately, these changes reduced escapability enough to the point where we were able to reduce the time to top sprint speed to a value of 0.8 seconds in order to make Spartan Charge more viable mid-joust. And for a quick demonstration, let's take a look at sprinting in a smaller arena map. What you want to pay special attention to is how I start sprinting when you see the enemy at the end of the hallway, and I can indeed reach full sprint speed by the time I reach them. All right, so that's time to full sprint. Now let's take a look at the next balance knob. Knockback distance. The goal here was to sell the power of the Spartan Charge and increase its effectiveness without making the target too frustrated. Other than straight damage, knockback is the most important value when considering the player's perception of power for Spartan Charge, and it creates an additional tactical advantage, a little bit of disorientation, knocking players off ledges, etc. And when we're considering existing metrics, I found that using the assault rifle's effective or red reticle range was actually a great relative measurement to ensure that the player can finish off the 1-2 punch. As a simple test for tuning at your desk, I made sure you could follow up with 3 assault rifle shots for the kill without touching the aim stick. So if your camera is level at the time of the Spartan Charge impact, just hold down the weapon trigger and you should be able to snag the kill pretty easily if you have the AR equipped. For stress test refinement, it turns out the assault rifle effective range was a great measuring stick, but knockback was inconsistent. Why is that? Well, physics is inherently unpredictable, and that's what we're using to drive the knockback. Physics can lead to a lot of fun interactions, but it can also be a designer, aka control freak's worst nightmare. So use it wisely, and only where the benefits outweigh the drawbacks. Because emergent gameplay is awesome, but predictability is king. So as a first step to get some more consistency in the knockback, we drive the attacking player backwards upon landing a hit in order to guarantee a minimum separation between the attacking player and the enemy. In addition, we changed the implementation to zero out enemy velocity in the direction of the bash. This guaranteed a lot more consistency with the knockback, as you'll see in a minute. And on a final note, vehicle knockbacks were tuned separately. This is the case for all physics impulses. The masses are just far too different for one value to get the desired results for both types of interactions. In short, the theme for tuning this variable is don't be afraid to cheat. There's a very good chance the player will never notice, and it's more important that player expectations are met rather than the laws of physics. And so, about 35 feet, that was the knockback distance we landed on. Here's a clip showing the final results. The first set shows our knockback tuning before canceling out the target velocity in the direction of the bash. So here's the player standing still. We've got a value of 6.98 world units. Here's the target running at you. It's going to be a much shorter knockback distance of 2.73 world units. And even worse, sprinting at you, it's going to be 1.54 world units. So this was after zeroing out the target velocity. 3.65 standing still. 3.65 running. and 3.65 sprinting. All right, that brings us to the end of the Spartan charge section. Let's take a look at the balance knobs for ground pound. We've got charge duration, minimum height, launch speed, damage, AoE radius, knockback distance, and recovery time. Again, we'll take a look at the values highlighted in blue before wrapping up this talk. Let's start with ground pound charge time. The goal here is going to be finding a value that's long enough for the target to see or hear the charge and react, but not so long that the attacker can't track the target. Where can we look for existing metrics? Maybe the plasma pistol charge time. As a side note, I never actually started by examining an existing metric when I started tuning this value. In writing this talk, I decided I probably should have looked at the plasma pistol, and when I went back to actually look at the value, we ended up shipping a time that was exactly the same for ground pound charge and plasma pistol charge time. So, some evidence that I'm not totally full of shit here. On to tuning at your desk. This one was actually kind of difficult to tune outside of monitoring use in competitive matches. However, launching 2 clients with another person to see if they can either 1, take you out with an assault rifle when the attack is visible, or 2, run to safety if they hear the attack off screen. So we found an initial charge time of 0.5 seconds that was okay in a controlled condition, and that's what we shipped in the beta. However, it didn't really hold up. Though it theoretically gave the player enough time to react in a controlled scenario, we found that time to be too abusive in real life. So post-beta, we overcorrected to 1.0 seconds, but then through extensive playtesting, we found our final value of 0.75 seconds. And that's really it. This really only went through some minor revisions after the initial tuning. What I really wanted to emphasize here with this slide was how helpful the existing metric stage can be. And to wrap up this variable discussion, let's just check it out in game. Pretty straightforward. There's a lot going on with the targeting reticle during the charge phase, which I could probably spend an entire talk talking about, but we're reaching the end here, so I'm just going to skip forward to the next balance knob, minimum height requirement for ground pound. The goal here is to avoid ground pound abuse by creating a minimum height requirement, but not have it so unattainable that it disappears from the joust. So where we're going to look to get an initial estimate? Well, let's check out some level building metrics. We've got half cover at 3.7, full cover at 7 feet, jump height at 9.5 feet. So maybe full cover plus jump height minus a little bit of slop at 15 feet could start. It felt like that was enough of a barrier for entry, and we knew the player would find opportunities to reach that height since level designers were already building full cover height into the maps. In addition, it's pretty easy for the player to recognize full cover because all they need to do is compare it to another Spartan that's in the map. So now that we've got a baseline value, how should we go about tuning at your desk? Really, just running around arena maps to make sure there were ample opportunities to reach this minimum height requirement was all I did. And how did it hold up under stress test refinement? This height actually worked pretty well out of the gates, but the thing that became more difficult to solve was what happens when the player isn't high enough to trigger the ground pound. For the beta, we shipped a fail state, which had you just drop to the ground if you weren't high enough, but this ended up being super frustrating and anticlimactic, especially in campaign. Post-beta, we implemented a weak version of the ground pound that had reduced radius and reduced damage. This way, you always did something, but not the full strength of the attack. So ultimately, we found an acceptable fail state for not being high enough, and that high enough value ended up being 15 feet. And finally, here's a clip showing the final results. What you want to pay special attention to is how easy Spartan-sized ledges can be identified by looking at another Spartan in the map. As you can see, ample opportunities to pull off the ground pound in just that small arena space. And in conclusion, it's time to sum up all the noise I made during this talk so that you might take some actionable learnings home with you. First, let's discuss some high-level guidelines for choosing where to innovate. Number 1, stay on top of trends. Make sure you've got your finger on the pulse of your audience and pay attention to what's trending in your genre to make informed decisions about where to conform or stray from those trends. For example, increased mobility in first-person shooters. Next, find a theme. In addition to following trends, make sure you define a theme to help guide your innovation, both fictionally and functionally. For example, it wasn't a coincidence that most of the new Spartan features revolved around thrusters, fictional theme, and mobility, functional theme. This will help focus your development and make your new features feel cohesive. And finally, don't be afraid to cut bait. Maybe even worse than not innovating at all is cramming your game full of superfluous wouldn't it be cool if features. This will make your game feel watered down and unfocused. If something's not working, or there's another feature already fulfilling that gameplay role, just drop one and keep the other. And for mapping actions to controls, remember that buttons are a precious commodity. When it comes to adding new player actions specifically, you are first and foremost limited by the buttons on the controller. Be extremely confident that adding a button combo is necessary and that no other action should be removed to make room for that new feature. Next, not all buttons are created equal. Not to hurt the D-pad's feelings, but it sucks having actions assigned to those buttons when it requires a quick press. Additionally, stick clicks, avoid these whenever possible and make sure it's okay if they're clicked by accident. Finally, balance and user experience are the king and queen. Ultimately, when evaluating control schemes, balance and usability are the top measurements of success. Some strategic sacrifice of player intent ended up being the compromise for both Spartan Charge and Ground Pound. I don't think that was a coincidence. And lastly, some guidelines when tuning for balance. Use existing metrics as relative forms of measurement. This may not be super helpful when starting a game from scratch, but when you're on the 7th iteration of a title, more than likely there are already guidelines and or precedents set for the value you're trying to tune. Also, find a quantifiable test for baseline tuning at your desk. This is super important, especially for the indie devs out there. Find a way to stress new tuning values at your desk that are representative of normal play. Maybe that means scripting AI in a specific way to recreate an easily repeatable use case. Whatever it is, make it happen. Finally, refine your baseline tuning by playtesting under as much stress as you're able to simulate. Depending on the size of your team and where you are in your project, this might be difficult. But make sure you do this when the opportunity presents itself, or better yet, make those opportunities happen with an expense and a cadence that you can afford, whatever that may be. And last but certainly not least, many people were involved with the development of these features I covered during the talk, but I have to give a special shout out to the following folks for playing an integral role. Tim Longo, our creative director, Chris King, our lead sandbox designer, David Pashut, our senior sandbox engineer, Pat Gillette, our lead gameplay animator, Jeff Palmer, our effects artist, and Sam Wolpert, another gameplay engineer. So, if you found this talk enjoyable and want to hear more about gaming in 140 characters or less, you can follow me on Twitter at Ryan Darcey. Thanks for coming to my talk, and I hope you take away some useful learnings to apply on your own. Feel free to hit me up with additional questions on the internet, and we should have some time now. So if you guys want, run over to the mic, and be sure to fill out your survey after this. It really helps us refine the talks for the future. So thanks, guys. I really appreciate it.
Hi. I was wondering, for your shoulder charge attack, you mentioned alternative controller schemes.
Yeah.
But you didn't for the ground pound. Did you guys force yourself to play with the alternative control schemes to see how that felt?
Yeah, no, we did a bunch of alternate control schemes for the ground pound as well.
Sorry, I mean, like you said, the melee is on the bumper.
Yeah.
But what if it's on the face button? Did you?
Right. So there's only one control scheme that has melee on the face button, recon, I think. Mm-hmm. And so that was one of those sacrifices where it was like, it sucks to have melee on the face button because you take your thumbs off the sticks, but it's just that one control scheme. So it was a conscious decision we made. Not great for recon, but yeah, that was one shortcoming for sure.
Cool. Thank you.
No problem.
Given the fact that you gave infinite sprint and more mobility overall to all of the Spartans, how did that impact the scale of your levels?
Well, I mean, I think our arena maps are still pretty tight. So, we tried to keep those at like a normal Halo size level, but certainly, it allowed for larger maps like you see in Warzone. That was one of the key decisions that made us take infinite sprint as opposed to a metered sprint, which was in Halo 4. So yeah, it definitely allowed for bigger maps, but I think it still worked on the smaller maps. And largely that was because we were able to curb the escapability through the shields not recharging while sprinting. I think that really helped out.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hey, can you talk about how the changes in the mobility that you made to the Spartan might have affected other systems like aim assisting or auto-targeting with the camera when it comes to, like I noticed with Halo 5, there is some kind of like forward displacement or even camera aim assisting when it comes to performing the melee itself?
Yeah, so when it comes to performing melee with assist, that's always been there well, not always, I can't remember exactly when we introduced it, but at some point we introduced a lunge where if they're within a cone, you actually lock onto them and lunge. We increased that distance for Halo 5, and that was because of the increased mobility. So you actually can lunge from a longer range in Halo 5. And then when it comes to aim assist and weapons, it certainly had an effect on that, and we had to retune every weapon in the game once we locked the strafe and top run speed and sprint speed. And that stuff was locked pretty early on. So yeah, it definitely had an effect.
Okay, cool. And then just one quick thing.
Yeah.
What happens if two Spartans charge into each other?
So we have a contest logic for melee. We've had that for a while, when two players melee each other. And there's some special magic that happens under the hood there. And we just kind of added Spartan charge as part of that context. And now there was, we could define how it reacts when two Spartan charge hit each other versus a Spartan charge in melee or a Spartan charge clean hit with no other contest. So yeah, we define different damages for all of that.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah.
Awesome talk.
Thank you, appreciate it.
And so I played a lot of the Halo series, like Halo, ever since Halo 1. And my question is, given that there was a similar role between boost jump and clamber in Halo 5, and I was wondering whether there were any additional reasons for excluding the boost jump, like related to balance, because I could imagine people abusing ground pound with the boost jump because you don't have to climb over something and activate the boost jump.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, so we had boost jump in there before we were sure that ground pound was going to get in there. Mm. So that specific interaction with ground pound wasn't really considered, but it certainly would have totally changed how we approached ground pound. So it did end up helping us implement ground pound the way we did by leaving boost jump out, for sure.
All right.
Yeah.
All right, awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Hey, so I saw that you ship with 10 control schemes.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, I know it's not really commonplace in consoles, but it is more in PC. Is it possible, or have you ever even considered letting players map their own controller? Because then you don't have to worry about, recon, I got to use like the claw to hit that one button. You can just make it whatever you want.
Yeah, that absolutely was brought up multiple times on the project. And one of the things that's tricky there is we, even for specific control schemes, we have special case logic under the hood that we have to implement to make those work. I'm blanking on an example off the top of my head, but ultimately what made the decision was the Elite controller being released as well, where you can remap the buttons to whatever you want. So that basically took care of everything. But yeah, there is still some special case logic for control configurations that we had to take into account. So if we just let the players do whatever they wanted to, it might get a little bit weird.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah. Over here.
For the Spartan charge specifically, I thought it was interesting that you pulled the camera out, and I was curious if that was a balance decision or a visual decision, or what inspired doing that.
Part of me regrets moving into third person for that one, because it can be a little bit disorientating for sure. But the decision was made early on to make both Spartan charge and ground pound third person, and it was largely from just selling the impact of the action. Like Spartan charge was feeling a lot like evade when we had it in first person, so it just kind of helped sell that you were having an attack rather than some boost. So yeah.
Cool. Thanks.
Yeah. Over here.
Cool. Great talk.
Thank you.
I'm curious about how changing and balancing the Spartan abilities, how did you work in tandem with the campaign designers, and how did that affect the campaign, since this seems like you're balancing a lot for multiplayer specifically?
Yeah, maybe TJ can come up here and complain about that. We definitely in the Sandbox group do stress test our features in the multiplayer mode first and foremost, and that's largely because the features come under the most stress there, so we're going to find the cracks more quickly and more easily there. So really the next step after that is testing how these things work out in the campaign sandbox. So it's a lot of back and forth. Like I said, boost jump, one of the reasons why it was cut, because all the level designers had already, gray boxed their maps and had certain areas that they didn't expect the players to get to. And if we put boost jump in there, it would have been like a huge rework to get all the maps redone. So yeah, it's tricky, and for better or worse, we do focus on multiplayer first. It does make it probably a little bit frustrating for the campaign guys, but I mean, it's our next most important step. So,
do you know if any of the abilities were changed for the campaign, or did you keep the same metrics of everything?
I'm trying to think specific. I know a lot of weapons changed up based on the campaign experience. I don't think we changed a whole lot for the Spartan, to be honest.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Thanks a lot for the talk.
Yeah, thanks.
Just talking about the golden triangle, it seems like a lot of these abilities are kind of buffing melee, making that stronger than guns or grenades.
Yeah.
Was that something you guys wanted to do to make melee a bigger part of the game? Or?
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of an explicit choice we made as part of the, talking about, like, what are we going to do for the Spartan? Like, what should we do for Halo 5? It was like, all right, we're going to do all these mobility upgrades, and then also let's take a look at melee and how we can leverage the mobility upgrades to bolster that. And it's kind of subjective as to, like, why we made that decision, but it felt like a nice packaged product to deliver in Halo 5. So
cool. All right. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. I think we're all good here. Thanks, y'all. Appreciate it.